Ladies and gentlemen, it is good to see you all again. It has been quite some time since I last put up a Periscope broadcast, but I'm very glad that you are here. My name is Craig Considine. I am a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And if you follow me on social media and you're familiar with my work, you will know that I am passionate about Christian-Muslim relations, and I'm also passionate about countering and fighting Islamophobia. What I want to talk about today is really a few things, but I want to start off with the very unfortunate event that happened in Normandy, France, where two individuals who reportedly had links to ISIS decided to enter into a church, and they beheaded a Catholic priest in the middle of Mass in front of churchgoers. So this caught my attention in the middle of lunch the other day, and it really upset me, not only because an innocent human life was lost, but also because the event really does stand in opposition to a lot of the stuff that I and my friends and my colleagues promote, which is understanding, peace, and pluralism. So, I want to say a few words about that, and then after that, I want to get into a discussion, or I will be saying a few words about Islamophobia, Islamophobes, and ISIS being two sides of the same coin. And that is the title of this Periscope here that you will see. And what I want to do is use the event in Normandy as a way of looking at how Islamophobes and ISIS have a similar narrative of Islam, but also how these two entities are actually looking for the same things in a way. So that is the objective of today's Periscope. So this morning, I had an interview with a reporter from Catholic News Service, and she asked me how I felt about the events in Normandy. And I reiterated much of what I had previously just said, but I also shared with her a few conceptual sociological theories to play around to try to understand why these events happen, and also the impact of these events, but also what we need to do as humanitarians and peace-loving people to actually counter the Islamophobia and the extremism and the exclusion that comes within certain parts of the so-called Muslim world. So I want to share with you this Venn diagram. I just put this together, so excuse the amateur style of it. But what we have here is a typical Venn diagram. And you'll see here we have the us, and here we have the them. So us and them can mean many things. It could be Muslim, non-Muslim, the Muslim world versus the Western world, and obviously these are not monoliths, but the world seems to be divided up into these binaries. You know, it's the Muslims versus the Christians. It's the civilized versus the uncivilized. It's the West versus the Muslim world. It's the developed versus the underdeveloped. And this is a really, really dangerous narrative that always comes out of these stories that capture media attention. Now, what we have here in the middle is what I call the we. So it's not me or you, and it's not us or them. It's the we. So this is the area that I like to call the gray zone. And ISIS, in their propaganda magazine, has actually used this term, the gray zone, and they've used it as a political mechanism in a way. ISIS wants to destroy the space where strangers or people in groups from different parts of the world can enter into a dialogue where they can learn from each other, they can understand each other. That common ground, that's the common ground that we all share. That is the space that ISIS wants to destroy. And ironically, the people engaged in producing Islamophobia, who we can generally call Islamophobes, they want to destroy that gray zone too. They don't want people from around the world coming together, exchanging ideas and stories, where people can come together, and Muslim and non-Muslim, Christian and Muslim, the West and the so-called Muslim world can come together and create something new together in peace with compassion. This is the space that Islamophobes and ISIS want to destroy. And an event like what happened in Normandy really does a number on the gray zone. It really does a number on this idea that we do not need to think in exclusive categories. That there is enemies out here, and that all Muslims in France or all Muslims in the United States are somehow strangers in their own land. That is certainly not the case. So the gray zone is a space that we need to cultivate as people that care about peace, that people that care about compassion and humanity, and people that don't like war and division. This is the space that we need to cultivate and the space that we need to foster. And this is why I'm engaged in a lot of the work that I'm doing. I critique Islamophobes, and I consistently write and denounce Islamophobia, but I'm also critical of a group like ISIS, because through my research, I don't see them as really representing, again, what I see as the true face of Islam, which is a religion for humanity. So we see something very interesting happening, and a lot of you are familiar with the term Islamophobia, right? A fear or aversion to Islam or Muslims. And ironically, a group like ISIS and their sympathizers are arguably Islamophobic as well. And let me say a few words about this. So in 1997, the Runnymede Trust, which is an organization based in England, came out with a report, which you can find online at runnymedetrust.org. And you can find a document that they wrote in 1997, which explains or breaks down this concept of Islamophobia. And they came up with a few distinct elements that help us understand what Islamophobia is and how it operates. And again, if we understand how Islamophobia works, we'll understand that Islamophobes and ISIS have the same view of Islam and the same agenda, and they have the desire to get rid of, again, that gray zone, where we don't have to look at each other in categories as enemies, where we can actually come together and unite and do solid things for humanity. So, the Runnymede Trust report, the first element of Islamophobia, and I'm sure you all are aware of this point, is that it's this idea that Islam is a monolith. So the term monolith refers to like a singular whole, one thing. Now, a group like ISIS, as many of you know, attack Muslims more than they do any other group. So ISIS's war is a war on Islam as much as it is a carrying out a war against the Western world, or however you want to say it. ISIS has a very, very narrow view of what Islam is about. They have a very narrow vision of how to implement Islamic values. right? So it's called tunnel vision. They see Islam only one way. They persecute Shias, they persecute Ahmadis, they persecute even other Sunnis. So they see Islam as being this monolith. Now, ironically, Islamophobes also see Islam as being a monolith. They don't like to recognize diversity within Islam. They don't like to recognize a great poet like Rumi or other Sufi traditions, which are talking about compassion and soul searching and love and peace. The Islamophobes just say, oh wait, no, these people don't represent true Islam. Who says that same exact thing? ISIS says that same exact thing, right? So we see Islamophobes and ISIS taking the same exact narrative. The second point that the Runnymede Trust pointed out about Islamophobia is this idea that Islam is separate and it doesn't interact, right? It's a complete different political, philosophical, ideological system that cannot be integrated into the world, right? So a group like ISIS is completely non-secular. They have a very rigid interpretation of Sharia. They see law made in by men and by women, by people through democracy is not true Islam. That Muslim communities need to separate themselves from these ideas, democratic representation, this idea that all members of a community should have a say in how a community operates. ISIS says no, Islam is totally different. It cannot interact with these principles. And of course, Islamophobes take the same exact approach. They say Islam is something totally different. It cannot be integrated. It's not possible for Muslims to assimilate because you have something like Sharia. Of course, Sharia is used and abused by Islamophobes day in and day out. They see Sharia as one thing as well. And ironically, ISIS sees Sharia the same thing. But Sharia is not a static concept. Sharia changes with the times. There's different schools of Islamic jurisprudence and so on and so forth, right? So it's this idea, again, that Islam, as if it's one thing, and Muslims are different and they cannot interact with us, okay? So another thing that the Islamophobes and ISIS have in common is this idea that they're also that Islam is also different. And this goes to the second point of Islam being separate and it not being able to interact with certain elements or certain traditions of other parts of the world, political philosophies and so on and so forth. Now, there is a slight difference here because a group like ISIS would say that their interpretation of Islamic values is certainly superior to anything else in the world, whereas the Islamophobes would actually say that Islam is completely inferior, right? So they have a similar approach in one regard, but it's slightly different. So there are many ways that the Runnymede Trust from 1997, this report that they made, actually comes to life in the modern era. And I encourage you all to go to the website, runnymedetrust.org, look up, you can simple Google search, just put in Islamophobia main points, Runnymede Trust, and it'll come up. So again, like what I'm getting at here, and what I want you all to take away from this Periscope is this: we need to cultivate the gray zone. It's the area between these binaries that the world sets up. The Islamophobes see the world one way. It's us versus them. And ISIS sees the world the same way. And all the voices in the middle are silenced. The media does not care about the people that are engaged in interfaith dialogue, who are doing God's real work on this earth, which is peace and compassion and humanitarianism. We don't hear about that in the media. And when the media doesn't cover it, people don't hear about it. And sadly, we live in a world where independent reasoning and investigation is not used by many people in the world. They get their information from the media, and the media only shows the extremes in the world. So going back to the Normandy case, obviously an extreme, horrific, barbaric act of violence that happened in the Western world in France. But, you know, if we go back 10 years when the invasion of Iraq happened and the U.S. was dropping, I don't know how many thousands of bombs on the Iraqi people, like, you don't really hear about something like that happening, right? So all the atrocities that happened with civilian casualties and so on and so forth. So clearly the media picks and chooses what it wants people to learn about and what people want to see. And usually we only hear about, in certain cases, the extreme cases. And we live in an age of extremism, and this is very dangerous. We need to roll it back. We need to find common ground. We need to understand where people from different communities, especially religious communities, can meet together and understand each other. As Rumi, one of my favorite poets who I often talk about on Periscope and elsewhere, said, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, there's a field out there somewhere, no matter where you are, there's a field out there. And imagine if you're talking to someone, there's a field out there. Go out there. I'll meet you there. That's where we can talk. We can sit in peace and we can have a conversation and we can have a dialogue about what's really going on. But our world is a world where only Islamophobes and ISIS control the narrative. And that is what is so dangerous. All the sane voices, the people who are building bridges of peace and compassion, they're not being heard. So I want to leave you with a point. And this is a point that I'm developing, and I hope to write a paper about it, and I think it'll be part of my book in the future. And it's stemmed off of this term called DEUCE, D-E-U-C-E, DEUCE, which means two, which also means peace. DEUCE, peace. So each letter of DEUCE, D-E-U-C-E, stands for something. And I'm developing this framework as a means of trying to build peace in the world, which is cliche and not enough people take it seriously, but I definitely take peace building seriously. The first point of DEUCE is dialogue. People have to want to come together and have conversations about where other people are coming from in the world. What do you stand for? Talk to me. Invite people over to your house. Open the door to your church and invite Muslims in. Share a meal. As Jesus did, break bread with your neighbor. We are human beings. We are not that different. We can come together. So the first point of DEUCE is dialogue. The second point of DEUCE is education. Now, there's a big difference between dialogue and education. Dialogue is when people are talking. Education is when you are sharing knowledge. In the context of what I'm talking about, interfaith dialogue, this is when you start busting out the Quran and the New Testament and the Bible, or the Hadith, the Sunnah, and so on. And you start saying, what about this passage? Let me educate you on why this passage is taken out of context. Right? So dialogue, you're talking. That's great. That's the first step. Education is when you start hammering the points. And you start sharing knowledge, not information, knowledge with people. The third point of DEUCE is understanding. Now this is the middle point in DEUCE, and this is very, very important. Understanding happens after the conversation and after the education. That is when people start recognizing why people act the way they do. Understanding is something that happens on a deeper, different philosophical and theoretical